There's just so much information flying around all the time. It's hard to know what really matters, what actually sticks.
Absolutely.
And when a major figure like Pope Francis passes away, you kind of want to get a quick, solid grasp on, well, the significance of it all
Right.
and what his legacy really looks like.
Exactly. You need context, not just headlines.
So that's what we're doing today. We're really going to delve into the news around his death, but also step back and look at the big themes, the core ideas that defined his time leading the Catholic Church.
And to really get a handle on that, we've pulled together quite a range of sources. We're looking at reports from places like PBS NewsHour, CBS News. Wikipedia is pretty comprehensive, Al Jazeera too.
Okay.
They give us everything from the breaking news aspect to, deeper analysis and background. And we're also drawing on Pope Francis's own words, his homilies.
Ah, good. So direct from him too.
Yeah, the idea is to give a really well-rounded picture, something insightful without hopefully drowning everyone in tiny details.
Right, exactly. Not every single fact, but the key moments.
Yeah.
The stuff that makes you go, ah, okay, that's important. Those sort of aha moments about his final days and his overall leadership. Okay, so let's start with the immediate news, his passing.
Okay, so Pope Francis died on Easter Monday. That was April 21st, 2025. He was 88.
88.
Yeah. And Vatican News reported the cause of death officially as a stroke, which then led to irreversible cardiocirculatory collapse.
Wow. And the timing. I heard something about his Easter address.
Yes, that's what's particularly striking, really poignant. ABC News reported he gave his final Easter address just hours before he passed away.
Gosh, that's quite something, giving that huge message right at the very end. Now, sadly, this wasn't completely unexpected, was it? He had been quite ill earlier in the year.
That's right. He'd had a really significant period of hospitalization. Al Jazeera gave some details on this. It was 5 weeks, running from February into March of 2025.
5 weeks, okay.
Yeah, and initially, he went in with severe breathing problems. Turned out to be both viral and bacterial infections, causing severe respiratory insufficiency.
And he had a history of lung issues, didn't he? Bronchitis.
He did. Al Jazeera mentioned that, too. He often struggled with bronchitis, especially during the winter months. So his lungs were definitely a point of weakness.
So it sounds like these ongoing respiratory problems really became a major issue towards the end. And that hospital stay, it wasn't straightforward.
No, not at all. The complications were quite severe, again, according to Al Jazeera's reporting. He developed this polymicrobial infection, basically multiple kinds of bugs, which turned into pneumonia in both lungs.
Both lungs, wow.
Yeah. And apparently his medical team felt he was actually close to death at one point during that stay.
Really?
He also needed treatment for an asthmatic episode. There were early signs of kidney failure starting. And one particularly serious event was a bronchial spasm. He had a severe coughing fit, and it caused him to aspirate vomit.
Oh, goodness. That sounds incredibly serious.
It was. It really paints a picture of someone in very, very frail health in those final months.
It really does. And yet he kept going. It just underlines his dedication, I suppose. So after he passed, what happened immediately? The announcements, the procedures?
Well, CNN reported the Vatican made the announcement very quickly, as you'd expect. And then AT News noted the College of Cardinals met pretty much straight away at the Vatican.
Okay.
Their job then was to set the dates for the public viewing, the funeral, all those arrangements. It's standard procedure during what they call the sede vacante period.
The sede vacante period.
Yeah.
Right. For anyone maybe not familiar, what exactly does that mean?
Oh, good question. Yeah, sede vacante just means the seat being vacant. It's the specific time between one pope's death and the election of the next one.
Okay.
During that interregnum, the College of Cardinals basically runs the church according to very specific rules.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And there was also news about his own wishes for his burial, something a bit different.
Yes, that was interesting. Vatican News released his spiritual testament, and both the New York Times and Vatican News highlighted his specific wish for just a simple tomb in Rome.
In Rome, but not in the Vatican.
Exactly, outside the Vatican itself. And AP News had actually reported way back in December 2023 that he mentioned this before, this desire to be buried outside the Vatican walls.
Huh. So it wasn't a last-minute thing.
Doesn't seem like it. Seems quite consistent with his preference for a less grand, maybe more modest approach, even in death.
A clear sign, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that covers the immediate events after his passing. Let's zoom out now and think about the bigger picture, his papacy, his legacy. I mean, where do you even start with someone who had such a global impact?
Well, I think a really fundamental starting point, something CBS News and Wikipedia both emphasize, is just his origin. He was the first pope ever from the
Right,
Americas,
and the global south.
and the first from the global south. That alone was huge. It brought a completely different perspective to the papacy right from day one. It wasn't just geography. It shaped how he saw global issues, the church's role.
Absolutely, a massive historical marker in itself. And that seemed to filter into his whole style, didn't it? I remember reading he was less formal,
Exactly. Wikipedia mentions his decision right from the start to live in the Domus Sanctae Martha.
which is the Vatican guest house, basically.
Yeah, rather than moving into the traditional grand papal apartments in the Apostolic Palace. And that wasn't just about where he slept. It was a deliberate choice. It signaled, wanting to live more communally, maybe be more accessible, less isolated than some previous popes might have seemed.
It definitely created that impression. He seemed more approachable to many people.
And that ties into a central theme of his papacy. Wikipedia sums it up well. A constant emphasis on God's mercy, high international visibility, a real, genuine concern for the poor and marginalized, and a huge commitment to interreligious dialogue.
Those themes definitely came through again and again.
They really did. They were woven through pretty much everything he did.
And he wasn't afraid to step into tricky areas, moral issues, sometimes even political ones, was he? I recall something about the Trump administration.
Yes, PBS NewsHour reported on that. He actually wrote an open letter to American bishops about the Trump administration's policy on mass deportations. He called it a major crisis that damages the dignity of many people and families.
So quite direct.
Very direct. It showed he was willing to engage with current political issues, framing them in moral terms.
Yeah. And CBS News talked about that image he cultivated, the populist pope idea, sort of positioning himself with ordinary people against perceived elites, sometimes even within the church hierarchy itself.
That's a fascinating dynamic. CBS News noted how he often suggested that even, local clergy, parish priests could become a bit detached, maybe too focused on status or privilege, and he constantly framed himself as being with the people, standing against that.
Which, as CBS also pointed out, didn't go down well with everyone. Reactions were definitely mixed, especially among more traditional Catholics.
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Conservatives, as CBS put it, often felt he had a very loose attitude toward tradition.
Right?
There's that famous little anecdote about when he first appeared on the balcony after being elected. He wasn't wearing the mozzetta, the traditional red cape.
Ah, yeah, I remember that.
It seems like a small thing, but for some, those kinds of departures from symbols and traditions were quite jarring, caused real unease.
It's often those symbolic things that carry a lot of weight, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, thinking ahead about the future of the church, CBS News and Pew Research both mentioned his appointments of cardinals. How might that shape who comes next?
Yeah, that's potentially one of his most significant long-term impacts. CBS News observed that Pope Francis really made a point of appointing cardinals who seemed to align with his general outlook.
Okay.
And importantly, he often chose them from parts of the world that had never had a cardinal before, far-flung places.
So, diversifying the College of Cardinals.
Very much so. Now, you might think that makes it more likely his successor will be someone similar in approach, but it also makes the next conclave somewhat unpredictable.
How so?
Well, because many of these new cardinals aren't as well known to each other or on the global stage, the traditional power blocks might be less defined. Plus, there's another factor CBS mentioned. Cardinals, almost by definition, tend to be somewhat institutionally conservative. And after a papacy that, as they put it, continually rocked the boat, there might actually be a desire among some for a period of, let's say, more consolidation, maybe less upheaval, someone who offers more continuity.
Interesting. So, a lot of different forces potentially at play there. It's not straightforward.
Not at all.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit to some of the specific theological points he emphasized. Wikipedia gives a good overview here.
It does. Evangelization, the actual spreading of the gospel message was always central for him. And church governance was another big one, particularly promoting this idea of a synodal church.
That term, synodal church, you hear it a lot in relation to Francis. Can you unpack that a bit? What does it mean practically?
Sure. Basically, synodality emphasizes a more collaborative, listening, journeying together model for the church. Think less purely top-down hierarchy and more involvement and input from all levels, bishops, priests, religious figures, and crucially, lay people in the church's discussions and decision-making.
So more participation.
Exactly. More walking together, listening to each other. Then, of course, the environment and climate change, huge priorities for him, famously with his encyclical Laudato Si,
Right.
and also what's known as the option for the poor. Just a consistent, driving focus on the needs and dignity of marginalized people.
And on specific moral issues, he made some pretty significant statements.
He definitely did. Wikipedia highlights his really strong stance against the death penalty. He formally changed the catechism to declare it inadmissible because it's an attack on the dignity of the person, essentially, intrinsically evil in the church's view now.
Okay, that was a major shift.
It was. And then on LGBTQ plus issues, his approach was, well, nuanced and generated a lot of discussion. He consistently upheld the church's teaching that marriage is between a man and a woman, and he didn't approve liturgical blessings for same-sex unions. However, he did authorize priests to offer non-liturgical blessings to individuals in same-sex relationships.
Right, the fiducia supplicans declaration.
Exactly. And that move, as Wikipedia and organizations like HRC noted, sparked a huge range of reactions. Some praised it as a compassionate, pastoral step towards inclusion. Others felt it didn't go nearly far enough, while some conservative critics argued it sowed confusion or even contradicted doctrine.
Definitely a complex issue with very strong feelings on all sides.
Very much so.
Okay, let's look at his international role. He seemed incredibly active on the diplomatic front.
He really was. Wikipedia details several key areas. There was his quite significant role in brokering the restoration of full diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. That was seen as a major diplomatic win early on.
Yeah, I remember that.
Then there was the deal with China. He negotiated this provisional agreement regarding the appointment of bishops there. But this was, and remains, highly controversial.
Why controversial?
Well, critics, as pointed out by The Atlantic and Reuters, among others, worried it gave too much power to the Chinese Communist Party and potentially compromised the church's freedom. Even the Vatican itself, according to Reuters, expressed ongoing concerns about the agreement potentially being violated by Beijing.
A very delicate situation there. What about the Middle East? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
He was deeply engaged there. Wikipedia notes his constant calls for peace, for a ceasefire in Gaza, dialogue. CBC News had this touching detail about how he made a point of calling the small Catholic parish in Gaza every single night during periods of intense conflict.
Wow, every night.
Yeah, they called it a singular expression of love, a very personal gesture. He consistently advocated for a two-state solution. But it has to be said, some of his specific comments on the conflict, as reported by JNS and Reuters, also drew criticism and controversy at times.
It's such an intractable conflict. Any intervention is bound to be complex.
Indeed.
And his focus on migrants and refugees, that was also very visible.
Hugely prominent. Wikipedia, Reuters, The Atlantic, many sources highlight this. He repeatedly spoke out, visited refugee camps, famously called the protection of migrants a fundamental duty of civilization. He was very critical of anti-immigrant sentiment and policies in Europe and elsewhere.
And he also made efforts to address historical wounds inflicted by the church itself.
Yes, a very significant moment was his trip to Canada in 2022. As Wikipedia, NPR, and CNN covered, he offered a profound apology to Indigenous peoples for the church's role in the residential school system.
That felt like a really important step.
It was widely seen as such, a necessary step towards acknowledging historical trauma and trying to foster reconciliation.
And what about building bridges with other religions? Interreligious dialogue seemed key for him.
Absolutely central. Wikipedia gives examples like his trips to predominantly Muslim countries like Indonesia, his meetings with prominent Muslim leaders, signing documents like the Joint Declaration of Istiqlal in 2024, which emphasized shared values. And perhaps most historically, his meeting in Iraq with Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, the country's top Shiite cleric. That was unprecedented.
That image was quite powerful.
It was. All part of his consistent effort to build understanding and find common ground between faiths.
Okay. Now, we have to touch on a more difficult area, the ongoing crisis of sexual abuse within the church. How did his papacy handle that?
It's undeniably a dark shadow and a continuing challenge. Wikipedia and Reuters note that Francis himself acknowledged the church was late in confronting the scale of the problem. He did put some new procedures and laws in place, like Vos Estis Lux Mundi, aimed at accountability for bishops.
But was it enough?
Well, that's the ongoing debate. Critics argue implementation has been inconsistent. And high-profile, difficult cases, like the controversy surrounding figures such as Marco Rupnik, as detailed by outlets like Crux and The Pillar, continued to raise very serious questions about transparency and the Vatican's handling of abuse allegations, particularly when they involve prominent individuals.
So a very complex and painful legacy there, too.
Definitely. Progress made, but clearly still much work to be done.
Right. On a perhaps lighter, more procedural note, I remember reading he changed the way papal funerals happen,
Yes, that's right. Wikipedia and the Associated Press reported on his reforms to the papal funeral rites. The goal was basically to simplify the rituals, make them less elaborate, less like a Renaissance court, perhaps.
which seems to fit with his overall style.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Consistent with that desire for a simpler, more humble church.
And even just looking through his homilies, his regular messages, recurring themes pop up there too, right?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at his Easter messages over the years, for instance, there's this incredibly consistent theme of hope. Hope, new beginnings, resurrection, overcoming death and evil, that's always central.
Hmm.
And he also spoke quite often about modern life, particularly technology. He wasn't anti-technology, but he often urged people to, put down the screen sometimes, focus more on real human interaction, face-to-face connection.
That message about human connection feels more relevant than ever, doesn't it?
It really does.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, how would you summarize the main takeaways? Thinking about his final days, but also the whole sweep of his papacy, what really stands out?
I think you see a papacy really defined by a powerful focus on social justice, the poor, migrants, the environment. Also, a very deliberate move away from the more traditional, maybe formal papal style. Significant efforts at reform within the church, like synodality, and also this huge emphasis on external dialogue with other Christians, other religions, the wider world. And underneath it all, this persistent message of God's mercy and hope, even amidst, global crises and challenges.
It's clear he made a huge impact, provoked a lot of thought and, as you said, reaction. And our goal here was really to pull together these different threads, these different sources, to give a richer picture than maybe just one single news report can offer.
Exactly. And maybe thinking about all this, the changes he made, the controversies he sparked, the diverse reactions from different groups, it leaves us with a question for our listeners, really.
Hmm.
Considering everything we've touched on, what do you think will be the most lasting legacy of Pope Francis? What's going to be his most enduring impact on the Catholic Church and maybe even on the world stage? And perhaps what questions has this discussion raised for you personally that you might want to dig into a bit more?